Good evening and welcome. Tonight we are going to sit with one of the most whispered about stories in American history. Not a story of battles or elections, though those will drift through it like smoke, but a story about a quiet fraternity of men in candle-lit rooms, aprons tied at the waist, speaking in symbols older than the nation they helped to build. You have heard the rumors. You have seen the eye floating above the pyramid on the back of a dollar bill. You have been told, perhaps late at night by someone very certain of themselves, that the United States was secretly designed from its first breath by the Freemasons. Tonight we are going to walk slowly through that claim, gently take it apart, and lay each piece in the light to see what is real and what is only the shimmer of a good story told too many times.
So settle in. Let the room grow dark and warm. There is nothing here to alarm you, only history unfolding at the pace of a slow tide. Let us begin on a September morning in the year 1793. In a half-built city that did not yet quite exist. Picture a stretch of low, humid ground beside the Potomac River. It is the 18th of September, 1793. The place will one day be called Washington, District of Columbia, but on this morning it is mostly mud, surveyor stakes, and grand intentions. There are no marble domes yet, no long avenues, no monuments. There is a foundation trench freshly dug, and a crowd gathering in the damp heat of late summer.
A procession moves towards the site. It has crossed the river by ferry and marched up through the raw earth with drums and banners. There are men in fine coats and men in leather aprons, and at the centre of it all walks the most recognizable figure in the country, a tall, grave man of 61 years, the first President of the United States. His name is George Washington, and on this particular morning he is not acting only as President, he is acting as a Freemason. Washington wears a Masonic apron, embroidered and pale, said to have been a gift connected to his French friend and comrade, the Marquis de Lafayette. In his hand is a silver trowel with an ivory handle. Around him stand the officers of 3 lodges, brethren from Maryland and Virginia, carrying the tools and emblems of their fraternity, the square, the compasses, the level, the plumb. Corn, wine, and oil are brought forward. These are ancient offerings, symbols of nourishment, refreshment, and joy, poured over the stone in a ceremony that reaches back, in its imagined ancestry, to the builders of temples in the deep past. The cornerstone is lowered into the southeast corner of the foundation of what will become the United States Capitol, the home of the nation's Congress. Washington kneels or bends over the stone. He checks it with the level and the plumb, the way a working mason would check that a stone sits true. He taps it with the trowel. The ritual words are spoken. A great feast follows, with an enormous ox roasted for the crowd, and the celebration stretches on into the afternoon. It is one of the most quietly astonishing scenes in American history. The building where senators and representatives would argue about war and peace, slavery and freedom, taxes and rights for centuries to come, was dedicated not with a simple political speech, but with the ceremony of a secret brotherhood, presided over by the father of the country himself. And here is the question that has echoed ever since. If the very Capitol was laid down with Masonic rites by a Masonic president, then how deep does this go? Were the Freemasons the hidden hand behind the entire American founding?
Did they design the nation the way an architect designs a building, according to a secret plan? Or is the truth something quieter, something more human, and in its own way more interesting than the legend? That is the mystery we will follow tonight.
Before we go further into the story, a small and honest request, the kind you have heard before, but which genuinely matters for a channel like this one. If you find this calm, and if you would like more long, slow, carefully researched history to drift off to, the simplest way to help is to subscribe. It costs nothing, it takes a moment, and it is the single largest thing that helps quiet history like this reach other people who are lying awake in the dark, looking for something gentle and true to carry them towards sleep. A like on the video helps as well, more than you might think, nudging it toward the next tired listener who needs it. And because this is a story built on questions, let me leave one with you now to turn over slowly as we go. When you picture the founding of the United States, do you imagine it as the work of a hidden brotherhood pulling strings from the shadows, or as the work of ordinary, flawed, brilliant men who happen to belong to many different groups, of which the Freemasons were only one? Hold that question lightly. By the end of tonight, you may find your answer has shifted. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is on your clock. There is something comforting in knowing who else is drifting through this same slow history at this same late hour. Now, back to the story. And to understand what happened at that cornerstone, we first need to understand what a Freemason actually is and where these men in aprons came from. What Freemasonry actually is.
The truth of Freemasonry's origins is far less dramatic than the myths that surround it, and far more human. To find its roots, we have to leave the marble halls of Washington entirely, and travel back across the ocean and across the centuries, to the cold stone building sites of medieval Europe. In the Middle Ages, the men who built the great cathedrals were among the most skilled workers alive. Cutting and shaping stone into soaring arches and towers required knowledge that took years to master. Knowledge of geometry, of load and balance, of how to make dead rock rise into something that seemed to float. These craftsmen were called masons, and unlike a serf bound to a single lord and a single patch of land, a skilled stonemason had to travel from one great project to the next, from one cathedral town to another, wherever the work was.
Because they moved, and because their skill was valuable, these masons organized themselves. On the building sites, they gathered in a workshop or lodge, a temporary structure beside the rising cathedral where they could store tools, take meals, warm themselves, and talk. Over time, the word lodge came to mean not just the hut, but the group of men themselves. To protect their trade, masons developed private signs, grips, and words, ways to recognize a fellow craftsman, and to prove that a stranger arriving in town truly had the training he claimed. A man who was fully qualified, who had served his years and could work on his own terms, was called free, a Freemason. That, historians generally agree, is the operative root of the fraternity, the world of men who actually cut stone. But somewhere in the 1600s, something curious began to happen.
Lodges of working stonemasons started admitting men who were not stonemasons at all, gentlemen, scholars, merchants, men interested not in the physical craft, but in its ideas, its symbols, and its fellowship. We have a record of one such man, the English antiquarian Elias Ashmole, who founded the famous Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. In 1646, he wrote in his diary that he had been made a Freemason at a gathering in Warrington. The other men present that day, when historians later researched them, turned out to have no connection to the actual stone trade at all.
This is the great turning point. The lodge was becoming something new. The tools of the mason, the square and the compasses, the level and the plumb, stopped being only instruments of construction and became instruments of moral instruction. The square came to mean acting honestly, squaring one's actions with virtue. The level came to mean equality, the idea that within the lodge all men met on the same footing, regardless of rank outside it. The plumb, which shows a true vertical, came to mean uprightness of character. The stonemason's craft of building a temple of stone became a symbolic craft of building a better man. Historians call this shift the move from operative masonry, the real trade, to speculative masonry, the philosophical fraternity that survives today.
Because the origins of Freemasonry are so often dressed up in fantastical claims, it is worth lingering a little longer in that misty world of the medieval builders, because the real documents that survive are more grounded and more touching than any legend. The fraternity did not fall from the sky. It grew slowly out of the working life of men who cut stone for a living, and we can still read their own words.
The oldest of these words is a poem. It is usually called the Regis manuscript, or sometimes the Halliwell manuscript, after the scholar who brought it to light in the 1830s, and it is generally dated to around the year 1390, though some careful analysis places it a few decades later. It is written in Middle English, in the rhyming verse of Chaucer's own century, across 64 pages of vellum, and it is regarded as the earliest surviving document of the Masonic tradition. What does it contain? Not secret spells or hidden conspiracies, but something far more ordinary and human, a set of rules for how a Mason should behave, towards his master, towards his fellows, towards the church, and towards the wider world.
The poem lays out 15 articles and 15 points, plain instructions in decent conduct. A Mason should be honest and steady. He should not take up work he cannot finish, nor meddle with the work of another master. He should keep the confidences of his lodge and his fellows. He should be reverent in church and orderly in company. Woven through these rules is a legendary history of the craft, tracing masonry back in imagination to the geometry of ancient Egypt and to the ancient Greek mathematician Euclid, and telling how the craft was supposedly established in England during the reign of the 10th century King Athelstan. This is myth, of course, a proud origin story a guild told about itself, not sober history. But it shows us something important. Even in 1390, these builders wanted to believe their trade was ancient, dignified, and morally serious. That instinct to attach high ideals to the humble work of the hands is the deep root from which all later Freemasonry grew. Over the following centuries, more such documents appeared, more than 100 in all, known collectively to Masons as the Old Charges. They elaborated on the same themes, the legendary history and the moral rules, gradually building up the body of tradition that the speculative fraternity would later inherit. And then in Scotland, the story takes a sharper turn towards organisation. In the closing years of the 1500s, a royal official named William Shaw, who served as Master of Works to the King of Scotland, issued a set of statutes to govern how the stonemasons of Scotland should conduct themselves and their lodges. The Shaw statutes, dated to the very end of the 1500s, required masons to organise into permanent lodges in fixed places, to hold regular meetings and to keep proper order in their craft. Here in the Scottish lodges, historians can see some of the clearest early bridges between the working craft and the organised fraternity that would follow. By the 1600s, as we have seen, gentlemen with no connection to stone-cutting were being admitted into these lodges, drawn by the symbolism and the fellowship rather than the trade. Elias Ashmole's diary entry of the 1640s records one such initiation. And from these threads, the operative craft of the builders, the moral tradition of the old charges, the organised lodges of Scotland, and the growing interest of educated gentlemen, the modern speculative fraternity slowly took shape. When those 4 London lodges finally united in 1717, they were not inventing something new so much as giving a formal head to a body that had been quietly assembling itself for centuries. And it is to that moment of formal birth that we now return. The birth of the Grand Lodge. For a long time these lodges existed quietly, scattered and unconnected, each doing things its own way. Then came the year that historians treat as the true birth of modern, organised Freemasonry. On the 24th of June, 1717, on the feast day of St. John the Baptist, 4 London lodges came together at a tavern called the Goose and Gridiron near St. Paul's Cathedral. They agreed to unite under a single governing body, a Grand Lodge, and they elected a man named Anthony Sayer as their first Grand Master. This was the first Grand Lodge in the world. From this modest gathering in a London alehouse, organised Freemasonry would spread across Britain, across Europe, and across the seas, wherever ships and soldiers and merchants carried it. A few years later, in 1723, the Grand Lodge published a foundational book, usually called Anderson's Constitutions, after the minister who compiled it, which set out the fraternity's history, as the Masons imagined it, and its rules. Those rules mattered enormously, and we will come back to them, because they shaped the kind of men the fraternity attracted. By the middle of the 1700s, the ceremonies had settled into a structure that endures to this day. A man joining Freemasonry passed through 3 degrees, 3 stages of initiation, each with its own ceremony, its own lessons, and its own symbols. The first degree made him an entered apprentice. The second raised him to fellow craft. The third and highest of these core degrees made him a master mason. Each step was taught through a dramatic ritual and explained through the imagery of building, of tools and temples and light. The famous third degree, with its solemn allegory drawn from the legend of the builder of an ancient temple, appears in the records around the middle of the 1720s. It is worth pausing on what the lodge asked of a man and what it did not. To join, a candidate had to be an adult man of good reputation, and he had to profess a belief in a supreme being, in a higher power, in God. But crucially, Freemasonry did not tell him which god or which church. A man's specific religion was his own affair. And within the lodge, two subjects were traditionally forbidden as topics of argument. One was sectarian religion, the divisive quarrels between denominations. The other was politics. Hold on to that last point, because it sits at the very center of our mystery. The official rules of Freemasonry told its members not to argue politics inside the lodge. And yet the persistent legend says these very lodges were the secret command centers of a political revolution. We will have to reckon with that contradiction. But first, we have to follow the fraternity as it crosses the Atlantic Ocean and takes root in the American colonies. The story of how Freemasonry reached America is a story of ships, ports, and letters carried slowly across a wide grey ocean. Within just a decade or so of that London gathering in 1717, the fraternity had jumped the Atlantic and begun to appear in the busy colonial cities of the eastern seaboard. The earliest firm footholds we can document are in Philadelphia and Boston. In Philadelphia, a lodge known as St. John's was meeting by around 1730, and we know this from a remarkable surviving account book, an old ledger the Masons themselves called Liber B, which records the lodge's early business. Boston followed close behind. In 1733, a man named Henry Price, acting on authority from the Grand Lodge in England, helped constitute what is often described as the first properly chartered lodge in the American colonies, in Boston, giving New England its own official Masonic presence. Consider for a moment what these lodges offered to a colonial gentleman in the 1730s and 40s. The American colonies were scattered and provincial. A merchant in Boston, a planter in Virginia, a printer in Philadelphia might have very little in common and no natural way to meet on equal terms. Travel was slow and dangerous. Society was rigidly ranked. But the lodge cut across some of those barriers. It was a place where men of different colonies, different trades, and somewhat different stations could sit together, share a meal, exchange ideas, and treat one another, at least for the evening, as brothers on the level. And it carried the flavor of something new and exciting, the intellectual current we now call the Enlightenment. This was the great 18th-century movement that prized reason over superstition, that valued the rights and dignity of the individual, that questioned the old assumption that kings ruled by the will of God and everyone else simply obeyed. Freemasonry, with its talk of brotherhood, of self-improvement, of a fraternity where a man's merit mattered more than his birth, breathed the same air as those ideas. For ambitious, curious colonial men, joining a lodge was a way of belonging to something modern, cosmopolitan, and forward-looking, something that connected a provincial town to the wider world of London and Paris. It is important to be careful here, and this is exactly the kind of care that separates real history from the whispered version. The fact that Freemasonry and Enlightenment ideas shared a mood, a vocabulary of liberty and reason and brotherhood, does not mean that Freemasonry invented those ideas or secretly controlled them. The Enlightenment was vast. It flowed through books, coffee houses, universities, pamphlets, churches, and ordinary conversation, through 1,000 channels that had nothing to do with any lodge. Freemasonry was one stream within that great river, not the source of it. Keep that distinction close. We will need it again and again. the fraternity spreads and splits. The two early footholds in Philadelphia and Boston were only the beginning. From those cities, and from others along the coast, Freemasonry spread through the American colonies with remarkable speed over the middle decades of the 1700s. And to understand its place in the founding era, we should watch that spread unfold and notice a division within it that most tellings leave out entirely.
The mechanism of the spread was the provincial Grand Lodge. The Grand Lodge in England, and later the Grand Lodges of Scotland and Ireland as well, would appoint a provincial Grand Master in a given region of the colonies, a leading local Mason authorized to charter new lodges and oversee the craft in his territory. In Boston, a merchant named Henry Price received such authority in the 1730s and is often credited as a founding organizer of regular Freemasonry in New England, chartering lodges and giving the fraternity an official structure. As the decades passed, lodges multiplied in New York, in Virginia, in the Carolinas, in the growing towns of the interior. Each new lodge was a fresh knot in a widening net, and each was tied through its charter back to one of the parent Grand Lodges across the ocean.
What did this spreading network give to colonial America? Above all, it gave a portable, recognizable fellowship. A Virginia planter traveling to Boston, a Boston merchant sailing to Charleston, an army officer posted to a distant garrison could each present himself to a local lodge and be received as a brother, vouched for by the shared signs and the shared charter tradition. In a world where the colonies were, in many ways, more connected to London than to one another, this was a rare thing, a genuine intercolonial institution, binding men together across distances that otherwise kept them strangers. When the colonies would one day need to act in concert against Britain, they would already possess, in the lodge network, one of the few structures that reached across all of them.
But here is the division that the legend almost never mentions, and it matters. Freemasonry in this era was not one seamless body. In England, the fraternity had split into two rival Grand Lodges. The original body, formed in 1717, came to be called the Moderns. A newer, breakaway Grand Lodge, formed around the middle of the century and drawing heavily on Irish and Scottish Masons, called itself the Ancients, claiming to preserve older and truer practices. These two traditions competed, and both sent their lodges across the Atlantic.
The distinction was not merely a squabble over ritual. In the colonies, the two branches often attracted different kinds of men. The older, more established lodges tended to draw wealthy merchants, royal officials, and the colonial gentry, men comfortable within the existing order. The ancient lodges, with their Irish and Scottish flavour, often appealed more to artisans, tradesmen, and men of humbler standing, the very sort who would supply much of the energy of the revolutionary crowd. In Boston, it was a lodge in the Scottish tradition, St. Andrew's, that would become entangled with the Patriot movement, while more genteel Masons sometimes leaned toward loyalty to the Crown. So even within Freemasonry, the coming revolution would find both its rebels and its loyalists, sometimes divided along the very lines that separated the ancients from the moderns. The fraternity was not a single mind with a single plan. It was a divided and varied thing, and that variety is one more reason the legend of a unified Masonic conspiracy simply does not fit the facts.
To understand why Freemasonry looms so large in the story of the American founding, it helps to picture what the lodge actually was in the daily life of a colonial town, and to resist the temptation to imagine something more sinister than the reality. The lodge usually met in the upper room of a tavern.
This was not unusual or secretive by the standards of the time. Taverns were the community centres of the 18th century town. They were where news arrived, where business was done, where clubs and societies of every kind gathered around long tables by candlelight. A Masonic lodge, renting a tavern's upstairs room for its evening meetings, sat comfortably among dozens of other social clubs doing much the same thing.
Inside, the meeting followed a pattern of ritual and fellowship. There would be the ceremonial opening of the lodge, the conducting of any initiations or advancements through the degrees, the reading of correspondence from other lodges and the Grand Lodge, discussion of charity for relief of the poor and of brethren who had fallen on hard times was central to the fraternity's purpose, and then very often a supper with toasts and songs. The atmosphere blended the solemn and the convivial, high ideals in the ritual, warm sociability over the meal. What the lodge deliberately created, almost as a byproduct of its structure, was trust. When two men had knelt through the same ceremonies, learned the same signs, and pledged themselves to the same code of mutual aid, they had a reason to trust one another, even if they had never met before. A travelling Mason arriving in a strange city could present himself to the local lodge and expect a brother's welcome. In a world without credit checks, without instant communication, without the dense web of institutions we take for granted, that portable trust was genuinely valuable. It knit together men across distances that otherwise kept them strangers.
Let us pause for a moment and step, in imagination, into one of those colonial lodge rooms on a winter evening. Because to understand what these men actually did when they gathered, it helps to feel the texture of a single night. The historical details we have allow us to reconstruct the general shape of it, even if the exact secret words remain, to this day, the fraternity's own to keep.
Picture the upper room of a tavern in Philadelphia or Boston. It is evening, and the fire has been built up against the cold. Candles line the walls, and the light they throw is soft and unsteady, catching on the pewter and the polished wood. The brethren arrive in ones and twos, shaking snow from their coats, greeting one another quietly. Each man, once inside, ties on an apron of white lambskin, a plain and humble thing, the badge of a Mason, worn by kings and labourers alike within these walls. That apron carried a deliberate lesson. In a society obsessed with rank, with who bowed to whom and who sat above whom, the lodge asked its members to set those distinctions aside at the door and meet for a few hours as equals on the level.
The room itself was arranged as a symbolic space. Certain officers sat in appointed places, each representing a station, each with a role in the ceremonies. On a board or a cloth were displayed the emblems of the craft, the square and compasses, the sun and moon, the pillars, the tools, arranged to teach through the eye as much as the ear. When the lodge was formally opened, the atmosphere shifted from the sociable to the solemn. Business might follow, letters read aloud, charity considered, the affairs of the fraternity discussed. And on some nights there would be an initiation. Imagine a candidate, a young man perhaps, nervous, brought into the room to begin his passage into the first degree. He would be led through a carefully staged ceremony, rich with symbolism, a kind of moral drama in which the ordinary tools of a builder became lessons in how to live.
He would be taught that the rough, unworked stone represents a man in his raw and imperfect state, and that the smooth, finished stone represents the character a good man labors all his life to perfect. He would learn the meaning of the working tools, the honesty of the square, the equality of the level, the uprightness of the plumb. All the 3 degrees spread across separate evenings, he would climb from entered apprentice to fellow craft to master mason, each stage deepening the lessons and the trust placed in him.
And throughout, secrecy wrapped the whole affair. Not the sinister secrecy of conspirators plotting harm, but the guarded privacy of a fraternity protecting its rituals and its means of mutual recognition. That secrecy served a purpose in its own time, but it would also, in later years, become the seed of endless suspicion. People fear what they cannot see. Society that meets behind closed doors, in aprons, exchanging secret words, invites the imagination to fill the darkness with whatever it dreads. Much of the legend we are unraveling tonight grew, in the end, from nothing more than the human tendency to suspect a locked door.
Now you can begin to see why, when the great crisis with Britain came, Freemasonry would appear so often at the edges of the story. The fraternity had spent decades building exactly the thing a scattered, quarrelsome group of colonies would need in order to act together: networks of trust that crossed colonial borders. But there is a vast difference between providing useful networks and secretly directing a revolution. Holding that difference steady in our minds, let us now meet the 2 most famous Masons in American history and see what their membership really meant. Who joined and why? Before we return to the famous names, it is worth asking a simpler and more human question, the kind that the grand conspiracy theories never bother to ask. Who actually joined these lodges and why? The answer, drawn from what historians can reconstruct of ordinary colonial membership, is quietly illuminating, and it has nothing to do with plots.
The men who filled the lodges were, for the most part, not shadowy plotters, but respectable townsmen on the rise, merchants and shopkeepers, lawyers and physicians, printers and craftsmen, military officers and minor officials. They were, broadly, men of some standing or ambition, for membership cost money in initiation fees and dues and the price of the suppers, and that cost quietly filtered out the very poor. Within that band, though, the lodge mixed men who might not otherwise have sat together as equals, and that mixing was part of its appeal. A prosperous artisan and a gentleman of leisure, meeting on the level in the lodge, experienced a small taste of a more equal world than the rigid society outside allowed.
Why did they join? For many reasons, and rarely the sinister ones of legend. Some joined for fellowship, for the simple pleasure of belonging to a circle of like-minded men, of having a warm room and good company on a cold evening. Some joined for advancement, understanding perfectly well that the bonds of the lodge could open doors, ease introductions, and smooth the path of a career or a business. In an age without formal institutions of credit or reference, being known as a good and reliable brother had real practical value. Some joined out of genuine attraction to the fraternity's ideals, its talk of virtue, self-improvement, and universal brotherhood, which spoke to the earnest, self-bettering spirit of the age. And some, no doubt, joined simply because it was fashionable, because the important men of the town belonged, and a rising young man wished to be counted among them.
There was also a deeply practical dimension that is easy to forget,
and it lay at the very heart of the fraternity's purpose: charity. In a world with no social safety net, no insurance, no public relief worth the name, the lodge functioned partly as a mutual aid society. Brothers pledged to assist one another in distress. If a member fell ill, lost his livelihood, or died, the lodge would often step in to help him or his family. The care of widows and orphans, the relief of brethren fallen on hard times, the quiet passing of money to those in need, all of this was not incidental to Freemasonry, but central to it, woven into its ceremonies and its self-understanding. For a man with a family and no other protection against the accidents of life, membership in a lodge was, among other things, a form of insurance, a promise that if the worst came, he and his would not be left entirely alone. Much of the real daily work of the lodge was not ritual or philosophy at all, but this humble labour of looking after one another.
One boundary, however, was firm and unquestioned. The lodge was a world of men. Women were not admitted to the fraternity, and this exclusion was simply taken for granted in the society of the time. Wives and daughters might attend the public celebrations, the parades and the feast day festivities that surrounded the lodge, but the ceremonies and the fellowship of the lodge room itself were closed to them. Only much later, in the 1800s, would associated orders arise to give the female relatives of Masons a place in the wider Masonic family. In the founding era, the lodge remained a fraternity in the strictest sense, a brotherhood, and the exclusion of women, like the quiet exclusion of the poor, and, as we have seen, the shameful exclusion of black men, marked the real limits of its grand language of universal brotherhood.
So the lodge, seen up close, was a very human institution, a blend of high ideals and practical benefit, of solemn ritual and warm sociability, of genuine charity and ordinary ambition. The men who filled it were not conspirators, but citizens, seeking fellowship, security, advancement, and a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. Keep that ordinary human reality in mind as we turn now to the two most extraordinary members the American lodges ever produced, because even they, for all their fame, were shaped by these same very human currents. George Washington, the reluctant symbol. No man is more central to the legend of the Masonic founding than George Washington, and so it is worth looking closely and calmly at exactly what his Masonic life involved, without either inflating it or explaining it away.
Washington's connection to the fraternity began when he was very young. On the 4th of November, 1752, at the age of 20, he was initiated into the lodge at Fredericksburg, Virginia. He was not yet the towering figure of history. He was a young Virginian of good family, ambitious, still finding his footing in the world, entering a fashionable and respectable fraternity in the way many young gentlemen of his class did. Over the following months he passed through the degrees, becoming in time a master mason. This was ordinary. It was the sort of thing a rising young colonial gentleman was expected to do.
For much of his life, Washington's Masonic activity was intermittent. He was a soldier, a planter, and then a revolutionary commander, and the long years of war left little room for lodge meetings. But the fraternity remained part of his identity, and in certain moments it surfaced in ways that would echo through history. when he took the oath of office as the first president in New York on the 30th of April 1789, the Bible on which he swore was borrowed from a nearby Masonic lodge, St. John's Lodge, because it was simply the handsome Bible closest at hand. Small details like this, entirely practical at the time, would later be woven by others into grand theories.
The great public moment, of course, was the capital cornerstone ceremony of 1793 that we began with, where Washington presided in his apron with his silver trowel. And in his later years, in retirement, he lent his name and standing to the fraternity once more, becoming the charter master of a newly chartered lodge in Alexandria, Virginia, the lodge that still bears his name. When he died in December 1799, his funeral included Masonic rites performed by the brethren of that lodge.
So the record is clear and genuine. Washington was a real Freemason, initiated young, publicly associated with the fraternity, and honored by it in death. But here is where careful history must part company with legend. There is no evidence that Washington's political decisions were shaped by Masonic doctrine, no evidence that he took orders from any lodge, no evidence that his choices as general or as president flowed from some secret Masonic agenda. Indeed, in his own correspondence, Washington expressed a rather measured view of the fraternity, valuing it as a society devoted to charity and brotherhood, while gently distancing himself from any notion that it was a hotbed of political scheming. He was a member and an ornament of the fraternity, not, so far as the evidence shows, its instrument. Benjamin Franklin, the enthusiast. If Washington was the great symbol of the Masonic founding, Benjamin Franklin was its most genuinely devoted and energetic participant, and his story shows the fraternity at its most influential, and also at its most easily misunderstood.
Franklin was initiated into Freemasonry in 1731 at that early Philadelphia lodge, St. John's, when he was in his mid-20s, a printer of rising reputation, but not yet the world-famous statesman and scientist he would become. Unlike Washington, Franklin threw himself into the fraternity wholeheartedly. Within just a few years, by 1734, he had been elected Grand Master of the Masons of Pennsylvania, an extraordinary rise. And Franklin did something with his printing press that gives us a concrete, documented example of Masonic influence, one we can point to with confidence. In 1734, he printed an American edition of Anderson's Constitutions, that foundational book of the fraternity's history and rules. It is generally regarded as the first Masonic book published in America. Here we can actually see Freemasonry acting through one of its members in a public way, spreading its ideals in print across the colonies. Franklin remained connected to the fraternity for the rest of his very long life, including during his famous years in France, where Masonic connections helped smooth his path in Parisian society during the delicate diplomacy of the Revolution.
Franklin himself once wrote, in a letter meant to reassure his own mother, who was uneasy about the mysterious fraternity, that the Freemasons had no principles or practices inconsistent with religion and good manners. It is a small, warm, human moment, a famous son gently soothing an anxious mother's worries about the secret society he had joined. It tells us that even in Franklin's own day, ordinary people wondered nervously about what went on behind the lodge's closed doors. So with Franklin, as with Washington, we find something real. Franklin was a deeply committed Freemason who genuinely used his talents and his press on the fraternity's behalf.
But even in Franklin's case, historians who have combed his vast correspondence struggle to draw a straight line from any specific Masonic teaching to any specific political decision he made. The fraternity gave him fellowship, connections, and a set of congenial ideals about brotherhood and improvement. It did not, so far as the evidence shows, hand him a secret plan for a new nation. The influence was real but diffuse, a matter of atmosphere and network far more than of instruction and command.
If there is one place where the connection between Freemasonry and revolutionary action grows genuinely tight, tight enough that even careful historians pay close attention, it is Boston. And so we should walk carefully into this part of the story, because here the mystery has real substance. In Boston, there was a lodge called St. Andrew's, and it met at a tavern called the Green Dragon on Union Street. The Green Dragon has come down to us with a wonderful nickname, sometimes called the headquarters of the Revolution. It was a hub not only of Masonic activity, but of patriot political organizing. The North End Caucus, a group of Boston activists agitating against British policy, gathered in its rooms. And the membership of St. Andrew's Lodge overlapped strikingly with the leadership of the revolutionary movement in Boston.
Two names stand out. The first is Joseph Warren, a physician, a fiery patriot leader, and a devoted Freemason who became a provincial Grand Master in Massachusetts. Warren would later die a hero's death at the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775, one of the great early martyrs of the American cause. The second is Paul Revere, the silversmith whose midnight ride would be immortalized in legend, and who was himself an active member of St. Andrew's Lodge, and would later rise to become Grand Master of the Masons of Massachusetts. Now here is the famous claim, the one you have surely heard. It is said that the Boston Tea Party of December 1773, when patriots disguised as Mohawk people dumped chests of British tea into Boston Harbor to protest taxation, was planned in the Green Dragon Tavern, in the very rooms where the Masons met. And it is true that some historians have long believed exactly this, and that the overlap between the lodge and the Patriot Circle makes the idea entirely plausible.
But this is precisely the kind of moment where we must be honest about the limits of the evidence. On the night the tea party would have been organised, the lodge records famously note that the meeting was adjourned for lack of attendance, an absence some have read with a knowing smile as evidence that the brethren were all out at the harbour throwing tea into the sea. It is a delightful story. It may even be true. But an empty lodge meeting is not proof of a Masonic conspiracy. What we can say with confidence is more modest and in a way more revealing. In Boston, many of the same men were both Freemasons and revolutionaries, and the tavern that housed their lodge also housed their politics. The lodge was one of the social spaces where patriots knew and trusted one another. That is a genuine and important connection. But it is not the same as saying that Freemasonry as an organization ordered the revolution into being. The men brought their politics to the tavern. The tavern did not hand them their politics.
If we want to see, up close, exactly how Freemasonry and the Revolution intertwined in the lives of real men, without leaping to grand conclusions, we could hardly find a better pair than Joseph Warren and Paul Revere. Their story is one of friendship, courage, and loss, and it shows the human reality behind the abstract question of Masonic influence.
Joseph Warren was a young physician of Boston, brilliant, charming, and fearless, and by the eve of the Revolution he had become one of the most important patriot leaders in the city, a rival even to Samuel Adams for the informal title of Father of the Movement in Massachusetts. He was also a devoted Freemason. He belonged to St. Andrew's Lodge, the Scottish tradition lodge that met at the Green Dragon, and he rose within the fraternity to become a provincial Grand Master, appointed to oversee Scottish Freemasonry in the region. Within the lodge, he was the master, the presiding officer, while Paul Revere served alongside him as an officer of the same lodge. The two men knew each other in the intimate way that lodge brothers did, through shared ritual and shared responsibility, and their bond of fraternity ran alongside their bond of political cause.
Warren's public career reads like a summary of the Revolution's approach. As a doctor, he tended the wounded after the Boston Massacre. As an orator, he delivered a famous address commemorating that event, speaking boldly even under the eyes of British soldiers. He helped draft an important set of resolutions defying British authority. He presided over the Revolutionary Provincial Congress of Massachusetts, and it was Warren who, on the night of the 18th of April, 1775, dispatched Paul Revere and others to carry the alarm towards Lexington and Concord that the British were marching. Then, on the 17th of June, 1775, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, fought largely on the neighbouring Breed's Hill, Joseph Warren did something extraordinary. Though he held high rank, he gave up any claim to command and fought instead as an ordinary volunteer in the front line. And there, on that smoky hill above Boston, he was killed. He was 34 years old, still serving as Grand Master when he fell.
His death was a shattering blow to the cause and to his friend Revere personally. Warren was buried hastily and namelessly on the battlefield by the victorious British. And here the story reaches its quietly heartbreaking turn. Nearly a year later, after the British had abandoned Boston, Paul Revere went to the battlefield to recover the body of his friend. Warren's remains, buried in a shared and unmarked grave, could scarcely be identified after so long. But Revere, in addition to being a silversmith, had done fine work in other metals, and he had once fashioned a false tooth, wired into place, for Warren. Examining the remains, Revere recognized his own handiwork, the wire and the artificial tooth he had made for his friend, and by that intimate token identified the body. Warren was then reburied with honor, including Masonic rites. It is one of the tenderest episodes in the whole revolutionary story. A man identifying his dead friend by the dental work he had crafted for him with his own hands. And it captures the human depth of these Masonic bonds far better than any theory of conspiracy.
Revere himself lived on to a full old age, and his own Masonic career continued to climb. He helped in later years to heal the very division we spoke of earlier, playing a role in bringing together the rival antient and modern Masonic bodies in Massachusetts. And in the 1790s, the silversmith who had ridden through the night to warn of the British advance rose to the summit of the fraternity in his state, becoming Grand Master of the Masons of Massachusetts, chartering many new lodges during his turn. He named one of his sons Joseph Warren Revere, keeping alive in his own family the memory of the friend and brother he had lost on Bunker Hill.
So what does the story of the doctor and the silversmith actually prove about Freemasonry and the Revolution? It proves that in Boston, at least, the two worlds were deeply entangled, that the same men who led the Patriot movement often knelt together in the same lodge, and that the trust and affection built in the fraternity spilled naturally into the shared work of rebellion. But notice what it does not prove. It does not show the lodge issuing orders or directing strategy. It shows friendship, courage, and shared conviction among men who happened to be both patriots and Masons. The fraternity was the soil in which their trust grew. It was not the hand that moved them.
There is no denying that Freemasons were woven through the revolutionary generation. We have already met Washington and Franklin, Warren and Revere. The list goes further. Robert Livingston, who sat on the committee that helped draft the Declaration of Independence and who administered Washington's presidential oath, was the first Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of New York. John Marshall, the towering Chief Justice who would shape American law for a generation, became the first Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Virginia. James Monroe, initiated as a young Continental Army officer in 1775, would rise to become the 5th President of the United States. The military side of the Revolution was strikingly Masonic as well. John Paul Jones, celebrated as a father of the American Navy, was a Freemason. So was the Marquis de Lafayette, the young French nobleman who became Washington's devoted friend and a hero of the American cause. So was Baron von Steuben, the Prussian officer who drilled Washington's ragged army into a disciplined force during the brutal winter at Valley Forge. In the army, lodges sometimes traveled with the troops, so-called military or traveling lodges, giving officers a familiar fraternity, even in the field. So the presence is real and substantial. But now we must ask the harder question, the one that separates a network from a conspiracy. Did Freemasonry, as an organized institution, plan and direct the revolution? And here the careful scholarship, including academic work that has dug deep into the archives of the Grand Lodges, arrives at a consistent and rather deflating answer. There is no evidence that the lodges operated as a hidden command structure. No evidence that Grand Masters issued revolutionary orders. No evidence that Masonic ritual concealed a political program. Masons acted in the Revolution as soldiers, diplomats, financiers, and statesmen, but reacted in those halls as individuals, not as agents carrying out lodge directives. In fact, the evidence cuts in a more interesting direction. Freemasonry in this era was not uniformly revolutionary at all. The fraternity traditionally emphasized loyalty to lawful authority, and many Masons, on both sides of the Atlantic, remained loyal to the British Crown. There were Loyalist Masons and Patriot Masons, sometimes in the same city. If Freemasonry had truly been a machine for producing revolution, it would not have produced so many men on the king's side. The fraternity did not tell its members what to think about independence. It gave them a shared language, a network of trust, and a set of ideals about brotherhood and merit. What they did with those things, they decided for themselves, and they did not all decide the same way.
The most honest summary that historians offer is this: Freemasonry was one influential current among many in the American founding, a place where men of different colonies could meet and build the trust that collective action requires. It shaped the founding generation. It did not run it. The lodge was a room where some of the founders happened to know one another. It was not the architect of the house they built.
There is one more corner of the revolutionary story where Freemasonry appears again and again, and that is the army itself. To understand it, we have to picture a peculiar institution of 18th century military life, the travelling lodge, sometimes called the military or field lodge. A regiment, whether British or American, might carry with it a charter to hold a Masonic lodge wherever it was stationed. When the soldiers made camp, the officers who were Masons could open their lodge in a tent or a commandeered building, conduct their ceremonies, and admit new members from among their fellow officers. The lodge went where the regiment went, a portable fraternity moving with the army through the long boredom and sudden terror of campaign. For officers far from home, uncertain of survival, these lodges offered a familiar ritual, a circle of trusted companions, and a comforting sense of order amid the chaos of war. It was in fact through just such a British military lodge in Boston that Prince Hall and his companions had first been initiated, as we will see.
Within Washington's Continental Army, Freemasonry threaded through the officer corps in exactly this way. Washington himself, though not an active lodge-goer during the war, was known to visit military lodges and to hold the fraternity in esteem, and his presence lent the craft prestige among his officers. The Army's Masonic culture drew in figures from across the improbable coalition that won American independence. The Marquis de Lafayette, the young French volunteer who became like a son to Washington, was a Freemason. Baron von Steuben, the Prussian officer who arrived at the frozen camp of Valley Forge and transformed a ragged, half-starved army into a disciplined fighting force through relentless drill, was a Freemason. John Paul Jones, the daring naval commander, celebrated as a father of the American Navy, was a Freemason. Across the land army and the sea, in the councils of officers and the cabins of ships, the fraternity was simply part of the texture of military life.
One small and revealing episode from the war shows the fraternity crossing even the line between enemies. When a British officer who was a Mason fell in battle near the American lines, Patriot Masons, in some accounts including men close to Washington, saw to it that he was buried with the honors of the craft, treating a fallen enemy as a brother, because the bonds of the lodge were understood to reach across the battle lines. Whatever the precise details, such stories capture something genuine about the fraternity's self-image, that beneath the uniforms and the flags there was supposed to be a deeper brotherhood that war itself could not entirely sever.
And yet, once again, we must hold the evidence steady and resist the pull of legend. The presence of Freemasonry in the army was real, warm and widespread, but it did not make the army a Masonic instrument. Most of Washington's soldiers were not Masons. Most of his decisions had nothing to do with the lodge. The travelling lodges were places of fellowship and comfort for the officers who belonged to them, not secret war councils setting strategy. The fraternity accompanied the revolution. It did not command it. This distinction, which we keep returning to, is the quiet key to the whole subject, and it will hold just as firmly when we turn, at last, to the most famous supposed proof of all, the symbols on the money.
If Freemasonry did not supply the founders with a secret plan, then where did the ideas of the American Revolution actually come from? This is worth dwelling on, because the answer quietly closes off one of the last escape routes for the conspiracy theory. The theory needs the founders' ideas to have a hidden source, but the sources are not hidden at all. They are sitting on the shelf in plain view, and we can name them.
The men who made the revolution were, above all, readers. Their minds were furnished by books, and we know which books because they told us endlessly in their letters, their pamphlets, and their libraries. From the English philosopher John Locke, they took the ideas of natural rights, of government resting on the consent of the governed, of a people's right to alter a government that betrays its trust. When Jefferson wrote of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he was drawing on a well-worn tradition of Lockean thought, not on any lodge ceremony. From the French thinker Montesquieu, they took the theory of separating the powers of government into branches that check one another, an idea stamped deep into the structure of the Constitution. From the classical historians of Greece and Rome, they took their fear of corruption and tyranny, their admiration for the stern virtues of the ancient republics, their vocabulary of liberty and civic duty.
They drew, too, from the deep well of English legal and political tradition, from the Magna Carta and the common law and the long struggle of Parliament against the Crown, from the writings of the English radicals who had defended liberty in the previous century. And they drew from their churches, especially from the dissenting Protestant traditions that prized individual conscience and distrusted concentrated authority, and that had already, in New England, built habits of self-government in town meetings and congregations.
This is the true intellectual origin of the American founding, and it is entirely public. It flowed through printed books that anyone could buy, through newspapers and pamphlets that flooded the colonies, through sermons preached from ordinary pulpits, through debates carried on openly in taverns and assemblies. The founders did not need a secret society to hand them their ideas, because their ideas were the common inheritance of the whole educated Western world in the age of the Enlightenment. Freemasonry breathed the same air, shared the same hopeful vocabulary, and gave some of these men a congenial place to gather. But it did not author their thought. The Declaration of Independence is a Lockean document, not a Masonic one. The Constitution is a work of practical political science drawn from Montesquieu and hard experience, not a coded lodge ritual. The ideas were never in the shadows. They were always in the light, printed and bound and read by candle by thousands of ordinary people who never knew a secret handshake.
Now we come to one of the most important corrections in this whole story, and it is the kind of quiet fact that dissolves a great deal of mythology in a single stroke. Popular legend tells us that the Founding Fathers were, as a group, Freemasons, that the men who signed the great documents were brothers in aprons almost to a man. The documented record tells a very different story, and the numbers themselves are the antidote to the myth. Let us start with the Declaration of Independence, signed in 1776 by 56 men. How many of those 56 were verified Freemasons? Careful Masonic scholarship, the honest kind that distinguishes documented members from merely rumored ones, puts the firm number at only around 9. 9 out of 56, that is roughly 1 in 6.
the overwhelming majority of the men who pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to American independence were not Freemasons at all.
The Constitution, drafted in 1787 and signed by 39 men, shows a somewhat higher proportion, with perhaps around 13 documented Masons among the signers, roughly a third. Higher than the Declaration, but still far from the near-total Masonic membership the legend imagines. Even at the Constitutional Convention, most of the framers of the American system of government were not members of the fraternity.
And now the detail that surprises almost everyone. Some of the most important founding fathers of all, the men whose ideas most shaped the nation, were not Masons. Thomas Jefferson, the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, the man who wrote the immortal words about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, has no verified record of Masonic membership. John Adams, the fierce advocate of independence and the second president, was not a Mason, though he is recorded as having spoken about the fraternity without hostility. Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant architect of American finance, whose face now stares out from the $10 bill, has no confirmed lodge membership, despite endless attribution. And James Madison, so central to the Constitution that he is often called the father of the Constitution, is not documented as a Mason either.
Sit with that for a moment, because it quietly demolishes the strongest version of the legend. If Freemasonry secretly designed the United States, why is the man who wrote the Declaration not a Mason? Why is the man most responsible for the Constitution not a Mason? The core intellectual architecture of the nation, the words of its founding creed and the structure of its government, came in large part from men who never knelt in a lodge. The Masonic founders, real and admirable as they were a minority, moving among a much larger crowd of non-Masons. The legend inflates a genuine minority into an imagined majority, and once you see the actual numbers, the spell begins to break. Prince Hall and the limits of brotherhood. There is a part of the story of American Freemasonry that the legend almost never tells, and it is one of the most revealing threads of all, because it shows the fraternity's grand ideals of equality colliding with the harsh reality of the world around it. It is the story of a free black man in Boston named Prince Hall.
Prince Hall was a leader in Boston's free black community in the years around the Revolution, a man of standing, an abolitionist, and an advocate for the rights and education of black Americans in a society that granted them precious little of either. Freemasonry, with its talk of liberty, equality, and brotherhood, its promise that all men might meet on the level, held an obvious and powerful appeal for a man like Hall. Here, at last, seemed to be an institution whose stated principles matched his own deepest convictions. But when Prince Hall and 14 other free black men sought admission to a white Boston lodge, they were turned away. The fraternity that preached brotherhood across all ranks would not, in practice, extend that brotherhood across the color line. It is a sharp and painful irony, and it deserves to be stated plainly, because it captures in miniature the larger contradiction at the heart of the entire founding. A nation proclaiming that all men are created equal while holding hundreds of thousands of people in slavery.
Refused by the local lodge, Hall and his companions found another door. In 1775, they were initiated into Freemasonry not by an American lodge, but by a military lodge attached to a British regiment stationed in Boston, a lodge working under Irish authority. This marked the first time men of African descent were made Masons in America. When the British troops and their travelling lodge left the city, Hall and his brethren were left with only a limited permit, allowing them to meet and to bury their dead with Masonic form, but not to carry out the full work of a regular lodge or to initiate new members. Under that narrow permission, they organised their own lodge and elected Prince Hall as its master.
Determined to gain full standing, Hall did something remarkable. He petitioned the Grand Lodge of England directly, over the heads of the American Masons who had shut him out. And in 1784, England granted a charter to what became known as African Lodge number 459, a fully legitimate Masonic lodge led by black men, chartered by the same authority that stood at the origin of the whole fraternity. From this beginning grew an entire parallel tradition, Prince Hall Freemasonry, which spread through the free black communities of the young nation and endures to this day as one of the oldest and most significant institutions founded by African Americans. It arose as a separate tradition for a painful reason, because the mainstream white Grand Lodges, for generation after generation, refused to recognize black lodges as their equals.
Prince Hall himself was no mere lodge organizer. He petitioned for the right of black men to serve as soldiers. He pressed the Massachusetts legislature against slavery and the slave trade, and he built the lodge into a foundation for black education, mutual aid, and civil rights. In the story of Freemasonry and the American founding, his life is the honest counterweight to the legend. It shows a fraternity whose noble ideals were real, but whose practice fell short of them, in exactly the way the young nation's ideals fell short of their own reality. The brotherhood on the level had a line drawn across it, and a determined man had to go all the way across the ocean to be recognized as a brother. There is one more current running beneath this whole history that we should bring into the light, because it explains a great deal about why suspicion of Freemasonry ran so deep and lasted so long. From very early on, the fraternity made the churches nervous.
The reason lay in that founding rule we noted earlier. To become a Freemason, a man had to profess belief in a supreme being, but the fraternity deliberately refused to specify which faith. A Christian of one denomination and a Christian of another meeting in the lodge were asked to set their doctrinal quarrels aside and meet simply as men who believed in God. To the fraternity, this was a virtue, a rare island of religious tolerance in an age of bitter sectarian division. But to many clergymen, it looked like something closer to indifference, a watering down of true religion into a vague and comfortable deism that recognized a generic higher power while stepping the specific claims of the Church.
The most dramatic opposition came from the Roman Catholic Church. As early as 1738, only 2 decades after the first Grand Lodge was formed, Pope Clement XII issued a formal condemnation of Freemasonry, forbidding Catholics from joining under threat of severe penalty. The papacy objected to the secrecy of the oaths, to the religious neutrality that placed all faiths on an equal footing, and to the fraternity's independence from church authority. That condemnation would be repeated and reinforced by later popes across the centuries, keeping a permanent distance between the Catholic Church and the lodge.
Protestant clergy in the American colonies had their own worries. Some suspected the fraternity of drawing men away from the church and toward a shallow, self-satisfied morality. Some, like one congregational minister who grumbled about the matter, fretted that the secret society was being used by rival denominations to advance their own influence. And ordinary devout families simply distrusted what they could not see. We caught a glimpse of this earlier in Benjamin Franklin's gentle letter reassuring his own mother that the Freemasons held no principles inconsistent with religion and good manners. That letter is a small window into a large anxiety. If Franklin's own mother worried about the lodge, so did countless others.
This long religious unease matters for our story because it was the soil in which conspiracy would later grow. When the Morgan affair broke in the 1820s and public anger against the fraternity exploded, it did not spring from nowhere. It drew on nearly a century of accumulated suspicion, much of it religious in origin, of a secret brotherhood that swore mysterious oaths, kept its rituals hidden, and refused to bow to church, or it seemed, to law. The eye behind the locked door had made people uneasy for a very long time before it ever appeared on a dollar bill. One of the best ways to cut through a legend is to let the people at its center speak for themselves. Unfortunately, on the question of Freemasonry, several of the founders left us their own words. When we listen to them directly, rather than to the theories built around them, a consistent and rather deflating picture emerges. They spoke of the fraternity not as a secret engine of power, but as a society of charity and good fellowship, and sometimes with a notable coolness towards its grander pretensions.
Begin with Benjamin Franklin, the most enthusiastic Mason among them. We have already heard his gentle reassurance to his own anxious mother, in which he told her plainly that the Freemasons held, in his words, no principles or practices inconsistent with religion and good manners. That is the testimony of the fraternity's most devoted American champion. And notice what it is, not a boast of hidden power, but a modest defense of the fraternity's harmlessness, offered to soothe a worried parent. Franklin valued the lodge for its fellowship, its charity, and its useful connections, and he served it faithfully for decades. But even he described it in these plain, unthreatening terms.
Now turn to George Washington, whose words carry special weight, precisely because the legend leans so heavily on his name. Across his life, Washington wrote a number of letters to Masonic lodges, thanking them for their good wishes and reflecting on the fraternity. In these letters, he expressed real regard for Freemasonry, but always along the same lines, praising it as an institution founded in benevolence, devoted to charity and to the promotion of brotherly kindness and moral virtue among its members. He honored it as a force for private goodness, not as a vehicle for political power. And when the conspiracy theories reached him directly, in that exchange of letters near the end of his life, he went further, explicitly denying that American lodges were part of any Illuminati plot, and gently making clear that he himself had had little active involvement with the fraternity for many years. This is not the language of a secret Grand Master directing a hidden design. It is the language of a man who valued a charitable brotherhood, lent it the dignity of his name, and firmly declined to see it as anything more sinister.
Even John Adams, who was not a Mason, and who would in later years grow uneasy about the fraternity's secrecy, is recorded as having spoken of it without hostility in earlier days, treating it as a respectable society rather than a menace. And on the other side of the great anti-Masonic quarrel that came later, President Andrew Jackson, a proud and open Freemason, defended the fraternity in public when it was under fierce attack, describing it, in essence, as an institution calculated to benefit mankind, and expressing his hope that it would continue to prosper. Here was a sitting president willing to stake his name on the fraternity's good character in the very teeth of the anti-Masonic storm.
Set these voices side by side, and a clear pattern emerges. The founders who belonged to the fraternity and those who merely spoke of it described it in remarkably consistent terms as a society of charity, virtue, and fellowship, valuable for the bonds it created and the good it did, but not as a secret power directing the affairs of the nation. When they defended it, they defended its benevolence. When they were accused of plotting through it, they denied the charge. Nowhere in their own words do we find the hidden hand of legend. We find instead men who joined a brotherhood, valued it for ordinary human reasons, and would have been baffled and probably amused by the vast conspiracy later generations would build upon their aprons. And that gap between what the founders actually said and what the legend claims brings us squarely to the question we must finally face. If the truth is so modest, why did the myth grow so large?
If most of the founders were not Freemasons, and if the lodges did not secretly run the revolution, then why did the legend take such deep root? Why do so many people, even now, half believe that the United States is a Masonic creation? The answer is a fascinating study in how myths are born, and understanding it will prepare us for the most famous piece of supposed evidence of all. Part of the answer is simple visibility. In the decades right after independence, Freemasons became the semi-official celebrants of American public life. When a cornerstone was laid, when a great building or bridge or monument was dedicated, it was often Masons who performed the ceremony, in their aprons, with their ancient tools and solemn words. They marched in parades. They laid the cornerstone of the Capitol, as we have seen, and later the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument. When the aging Lafayette returned to America for a triumphant grand tour in the 1820s, he was greeted at stop after stop by Masonic brethren as one of their own. Freemasonry was, for a time, woven visibly into the public rituals of the young republic. If you saw Masons dedicating the nation's most important buildings, it was natural, if mistaken, to assume they had built the nation itself.
Part of the answer is the sheer fame of Washington and Franklin. These were the two most celebrated Americans of their age, and both were genuine, well-documented Masons. When the two brightest stars in the founding sky are both Freemasons, the human mind leaps easily to the conclusion that the whole constellation must be Masonic. The prominence of two real members got generalized, wrongly, onto the entire founding generation. And part of the answer, the largest part, is a set of powerful visual symbols that seem, at first glance, to prove the whole theory in a single image. Symbols that most Americans carry in their pockets every day. To understand how the legend became unshakable, we have to look closely at the back of a $1 bill. 6 years and 3 committees. Before we examine the symbols on the dollar and take apart the myths attached to them, it is worth telling the full story of how the Great Seal was actually designed, because the true tale, slow, bureaucratic, and stumbling, is itself the strongest evidence against any theory of a secret guiding hand. No hidden order works like this. Only a committee does.
The story begins on the very day of American independence, on the 4th of July, 1776, just hours after adopting the Declaration. The Continental Congress turned to the practical matter of a national seal, an emblem to mark the sovereignty of the new nation. Congress appointed a first committee to design it, and the 3 men it chose are famous indeed: Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams. Of those 3, only Franklin was a Freemason. To help them, they brought in an artist, a Swiss-born naturalist and heraldic designer named Pierre du Cimetière. Each man contributed ideas. Franklin, as we noted, proposed a dramatic scene of Moses parting the Red Sea, drowning Pharaoh's army. Jefferson suggested the children of Israel, led by a pillar of fire, and also an image drawn from the legendary ancestors of the English people. Du Cimetière, for his part, proposed a shield representing the nations from which Americans had come, flanked by the figures of liberty and justice, and most importantly, he offered 2 elements that would survive to the end: an Eye of Providence set in a radiant triangle, and the Latin motto that endures to this day, E pluribus unum, meaning out of many, one. Congress received this first committee's design in August of 1776, looked it over and quietly set it aside as too complicated. Only the motto and the seed of the eye survived.
4 years passed. The revolution consumed everyone's attention, and the seal lay forgotten. Then, in 1780, Congress appointed a second committee, made up of different men, and this committee brought in another talented consultant, Francis Hopkinson, a signer of the Declaration and the designer of an early American flag. Hopkinson's contributions proved lasting. From his work came the 13 red and white stripes on the shield, the constellation of 13 stars, and the pairing of an olive branch for peace with a cluster of arrows for war. Yet this second design, too, failed to satisfy Congress and was tabled.
2 more years passed, and the war neared its end. With peace approaching, a proper seal became urgent, for a sovereign nation would need to affix its own emblem to the coming treaty. So, in the spring of 1782, Congress appointed a third committee, and this one turned for help to a young Philadelphia lawyer named William Barton, skilled in the art of heraldry. Barton produced elaborate, cluttered designs, crowded with dozens of emblems, far too busy to serve. But 2 of his contributions mattered enormously. He was the first to place an eagle in the design, though at this stage only as a small figure. And for the reverse of the seal, he revived the unfinished pyramid topped by the radiant eye, an image with roots in the very first committee's work, and in the pyramid that had appeared on a piece of continental currency designed by Hopkinson a few years earlier. Congress reviewed this third design and, true to form, rejected it as well.
3 committees, 6 years, 3 rejections. At last, in the middle of 1782, Congress handed the whole tangled mess, all 3 committees' designs and drawings, to one man, Charles Thomson, the faithful secretary of the Continental Congress, and asked him simply to produce something workable. Thomson, who was not a Freemason, sat down with the accumulated ideas of 6 years and performed an act of synthesis. He made the eagle the central figure, no longer small but bold and dominant, an American bald eagle, clutching the olive branch of peace in one talon and the arrows of war in the other. He arranged the 13 stars above it and gave it the motto E pluribus unum. For the reverse, he kept the unfinished pyramid and the Eye of Providence, and he added 2 more Latin mottos, one speaking of divine favour upon the nation's undertakings, the other proclaiming a new order of the ages. Thompson's design, lightly revised once more by Barton, was submitted to Congress and on the 20th of June 1782 at last approved.
Look closely at that history, and the conspiracy theory simply dissolves in your hands. The seal was not the swift, deliberate work of a secret brotherhood imprinting its mark on the nation. It was the fumbling product of 6 years, 3 failed committees, a half-dozen consultants, and a final rescue by a records-keeping secretary who was not a Mason at all. The one Freemason in the whole long process, Franklin, saw his contribution reduced to almost nothing, his Moses scene discarded, his role ending in the very first committee. If Freemasonry had wished to brand the United States with its symbols, this shambling 6-year committee process is surely the least efficient conspiracy ever devised. The truth is that the seal was assembled the way most things are assembled in a republic, slowly, by many hands, out of compromise and revision, in the open light of a legislature. And it is those very symbols, born of that ordinary process, that would later be so thoroughly misunderstood.
Take out a $1 bill, or picture one in your mind, and turn it over to the back. On the left side, you will find a strange and striking image, an unfinished pyramid of stone, rising in 13 layers towards a flattened top, where the capstone is missing. And hovering above that empty summit, enclosed in a radiant triangle and surrounded by rays of light, is a single open eye. Above the eye float 2 Latin words, and beneath the pyramid 2 more. To countless people over the years, this image has seemed like the smoking gun, undeniable proof that Freemasons, and perhaps a shadowy group called the Illuminati, secretly stamped their mark on the very money of the United States. It is one of the most quietly misunderstood images in the world, and the true story behind it, once you follow it patiently, is far more interesting than the conspiracy, and far less sinister. So let us take it apart slowly, piece by piece, the way you might examine an old coin under a lamp.
The image is one side of the Great Seal of the United States, the official emblem of the nation's sovereignty. And the first fact that begins to dissolve the myth is the fact of when it was designed. The Great Seal was created and adopted in 1782, 6 years after independence was declared. It was not the work of a single mysterious hand. It was the product of 3 separate committees, working over the course of 6 years, passing the task back and forth, revising and rejecting one another's ideas, until at last a final design was assembled by 2 men, Charles Thompson, the Secretary of the Continental Congress, and a Philadelphia lawyer named William Barton. Here is the crucial point. Of all the many men involved across those 3 committees, only one was a practicing Freemason, and that was Benjamin Franklin, who sat on the very first committee. And what did Franklin propose for the seal? Not a pyramid, not an eye. Franklin's suggestion was a dramatic biblical scene. Moses parting the Red Sea, while Pharaoh's army drowns in the returning waves. Congress rejected it entirely. The one Mason involved in the whole process had his idea thrown out. And the symbols that conspiracy theorists point to, the pyramid and the eye, came from the non-Masonic designers who followed. The single Freemason in the room did not put those symbols there. That fact alone should give any honest theory serious pause. Let us go further, because each individual symbol has its own honest history,
and none of them leads where the legend claims.
Consider the eye first, the famous all-seeing eye. It is properly called the Eye of Providence, and it represents the watchful care of God over human affairs. And here is the detail that quietly undoes the whole Masonic theory. The Eye of Providence is far older than its use by Freemasons. It appears in European Christian religious art of the Renaissance, long before any Masonic lodge adopted it, as a symbol of divine watchfulness, the eye of God gazing down upon the world. When the designers of the Great Seal reached for an image of divine favor watching over the new nation, they were reaching into a long-established Christian and artistic tradition, not into a Masonic one.
And the timing seals the case. The Great Seal placed its eye upon the design in 1782. Freemasonry, as an organization, did not formally adopt the Eye of Providence as one of its own standard emblems until later, generally traced to around 1797, when a Masonic writer named Thomas Smith Webb published an influential book of Masonic instruction. That is roughly 15 years after the eye already appeared on the Great Seal. The nation used the symbol first. The Freemasons adopted it as a common emblem afterward. The arrow of influence, if anything, points the opposite way from the legend.
Now the pyramid, the unfinished pyramid, was meant to symbolize strength and duration, a structure built to last, and its incompleteness signaled that the work of building the nation was not yet finished. Its 13 layers of stone stood for the 13 original states. This was not, in 1782, a standard Masonic symbol at all. In fact, the pyramid was not part of the fraternity's rich vocabulary of emblems at the time the seal was designed. The Masons would only fold such imagery into their own symbolism later. The pyramid on the seal was a general emblem of permanence, borrowed from the ancient world's most famous example of a structure that had endured across the ages.
Then there are the 2 Latin mottos. Above the eye, the words Annuit Coptis, which can be rendered as He has favoured our undertakings, a statement of hope that Providence smiles upon the new nation's endeavours. Below the pyramid, the words Novus Order Seclorum, meaning a new order of the ages, expressing the sense that the founding of the American Republic opened a new era in human history. Neither phrase is a secret Masonic incantation. Both are drawn from the poetry of the ancient Roman writer Virgil, filtered through the classical education that nearly every educated man of that era shared. They speak of a new age and of divine favour, sentiments entirely at home in the ordinary hopeful language of the founding, with no hidden meaning smuggled in. 2 more threads of the legend deserve to be gently untangled, because they are the ones most often repeated with the greatest confidence.
The first involves that shadowy group, the Illuminati. Cut into the base of the pyramid in Roman numerals is the year 1776, the year of American independence. Now, it happens that a secretive society, calling itself the Bavarian Illuminati, was founded far away in Germany in that very same year, 1776, by a man named Adam Weishaupt. Conspiracy theories have made much of this coincidence, treating the shared date as proof of a hidden link between the Illuminati and the American founding. But it is exactly that, a coincidence. The men who designed the Great Seal had no contact whatsoever with Weishaupt or his group. The reason both the American founding and the founding of the Bavarian Illuminati fell in 1776 is simply that this was the height of the Enlightenment, an age brimming with new societies, new ideas, and new beginnings all across the Western world. Two unrelated things happened in the same busy year. That is all.
The second thread is perhaps the most powerful, because it dissolves the entire theory with a single stubborn stretch of time. If the Great Seal was adopted in 1782, and if it truly represented a secret plot woven into the nation's founding, then you would expect it to have been placed before the public immediately, stamped on the money for all to see. But it was not. For roughly the first century and a half of American history, the Great Seal remained a government instrument, pressed into wax to authenticate treaties and documents. Its reverse side, the side with the pyramid and the eye, was almost never seen by ordinary people at all. It simply did not appear on the currency.
That changed only in the year 1935, during the depths of the Great Depression, when the reverse of the Great Seal was placed on the back of the $1 bill. The decision came about in a rather ordinary bureaucratic way. A government official, the Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace, a man with a genuine personal interest in symbolism and esoteric philosophy, noticed the striking reverse of the seal and brought it to the attention of President Franklin Roosevelt, who approved placing both sides of the seal on the new dollar bill. Both Wallace and Roosevelt were Freemasons, which the legend seizes upon. But notice what this actually means. The symbols reached the dollar not through an 18th-century founding conspiracy, but through a 1930s design decision, made a full 153 years after the seal was created. Anyone claiming the pyramid on the dollar proves a secret plot at the birth of the nation has to explain away that enormous gap of more than a century and a half. The gap, quietly, is the answer. There was no ancient plot. There was a Depression-era choice about how to decorate a banknote.
Two particular details on that dollar bill deserve their own careful attention, because they generate more confusion than almost anything else, and clearing them up is one of the most satisfying pieces of this whole investigation. They are the ominous-sounding Latin motto beneath the pyramid and the strange abundance of the number 13 scattered across the seal. Start with the motto. Beneath the pyramid run the words Novus Ordo Seclorum, and countless people encountering that phrase translate it in their heads as New World Order, hearing in it a chilling announcement of some plan for global domination. It is one of the most widespread mistranslations in popular history, and it is simply wrong. The phrase does not mean New World Order. It means, correctly, a new order of the ages, or a new order for the generations. The word in question does not mean world at all, but rather an age, an era, a span of generations. And the meaning the designers intended was hopeful and entirely open, that with the founding of the American Republic, a new era in the long story of human government had begun.
We even know exactly where the phrase came from, and it was not from any lodge. Charles Thomson, the secretary who assembled the final seal, adapted it from the poetry of the ancient Roman writer Virgil, who in one of his most famous poems had written of a great new order of the ages being born, a line long read in the Western tradition as a hopeful prophecy of a renewed golden age. Thomson, steeped like every educated man of his time in the Latin classics, reached for Virgil to express the founder's sense that they were beginning something genuinely new in the world. The motto was adopted in 1782
generations before the modern political phrase New World Order was ever coined, and it carries none of that later, darker meaning. To read the phrase from a 20th century conspiracy back onto an 18th century seal is to hear a warning where the founders meant only a hymn of hope.
Now the number 13. Once you start looking, you find it everywhere on the seal, and the effect can seem almost eerie. There are 13 stars in the constellation above the eagle. There are 13 stripes on the shield. The eagle grips 13 arrows in one talon, and an olive branch bearing 13 leaves and 13 olives in the other. The pyramid rises in 13 courses of stone, and the two Latin mottos on the reverse, the one above the eye and the one that is E pluribus unum, each contain, when you count the letters, exactly 13. To a mind hunting for hidden numerology, this repetition of 13 looks like a secret code, perhaps a sinister one, since the number carries a whiff of superstition in popular culture.
But the explanation could hardly be more innocent, and it is hiding in plain sight. There were 13 original states. The whole seal is quite deliberately and openly a monument to those 13 states that joined together to make a nation. The 13 stars are the 13 states. The 13 stripes are the 13 states. The 13 steps of the pyramid are the 13 states. The designers repeated the number on purpose as a proud and obvious tribute to the union of the 13, and they were pleased enough with the pattern to arrange even the mottos so that their letters too numbered 13. There is nothing occult about it whatsoever. It is patriotic arithmetic, a designer's affectionate insistence on honouring again and again the 13 founding members of the new republic. The number that superstition treats as unlucky, the founders treated as sacred, because it was the number of the states that had dared to become a country.
And so both of these supposedly sinister details, the dark motto and the eerie number, turn out to be exactly what an honest reading would suggest, an expression of hope for a new national era and a proud tribute to the 13 founding states. The menace exists only in the mistranslation and the misreading. Cleared of both, the reverse of the seal becomes simply what its makers intended, a hopeful emblem of a new nation built from 13 parts, watched over, they hoped, by a benevolent providence.
So when you next turn over a dollar bill and see that eye above the pyramid, you can look at it with clearer eyes of your own. What you are seeing is not a Masonic brand or an Illuminati signature. You are seeing a genuine piece of the young nation's hopeful self-image, assembled by committee, drawn from Christian art and classical Roman poetry, and the ordinary emblems of permanence and providence that any educated 18th century designer would have reached for. An unfinished pyramid, because the work of the nation was not yet done. 13 courses of stone for the 13 states. An eye of divine favour watching over the fragile new experiment. A new order of the ages, because they truly believed they were beginning something new in the story of the world.
There is meaning there, and even a kind of beauty. But it is the meaning the founders openly intended, hiding in plain sight, not a coded message meant only for initiates. The great irony of the dollar bill is that the truth was never concealed at all. It was written in the historical record for anyone patient enough to read it. It only looked like a secret because the story that grew up around it was more thrilling than the quiet facts.
And now, having watched Freemasonry rise to such visible prominence in the young republic, we come to the strange and sudden chapter in which it very nearly collapsed. Because the same fraternity that laid the capital's cornerstone would, within a single generation, be driven to the edge of destruction by a scandal in a small town in New York. The Continental Cousins. To make full sense of the conspiracy theories that gathered around American Freemasonry, we have to step briefly across the Atlantic once more, because a great deal of the confusion comes from mixing up two rather different things that happen to share a name. The Freemasonry of England, Scotland, and America was one creature. The Freemasonry that developed on the European continent, especially in France, was in important ways another. Anglo-American Freemasonry, the tradition that shaped Washington and Franklin and the colonial lodges, kept to certain firm rules. It required belief in a supreme being. It forbade the discussion of politics and sectarian religion within the lodge. It presented itself as loyal, respectable, and devoted to charity and self-improvement, deliberately steering clear of subversion. Its whole style was cautious and conservative, a fraternity that wished to be seen as a pillar of the social order, not a threat to it. Continental Freemasonry, particularly in France, drifted in a different direction. There, in the decades before the French Revolution, some lodges became far more openly political and philosophical, and some branches grew willing to loosen or set aside the requirement of belief in God, taking on a more skeptical, even anti-clerical character. The largest French Masonic body moved along its own path, and French lodges became gathering places for the restless intellectual energy of a country sliding toward upheaval. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789 and then descended into the Bloody Terror, frightened conservatives across Europe looked for someone to blame, and the secretive, philosophical, politically tinged lodges of France made an inviting target. This distinction matters enormously for our story, because the conspiracy theories that would soon frighten America took the political character of some continental lodges and smeared it across all of Freemasonry everywhere, including the cautious, loyal, apolitical lodges of the English-speaking world. It was a little like judging every tavern in the world by the worst brawl in one particular city. The apolitical American Mason, quietly attending to his charity and his ritual, would find himself accused of belonging to the same sinister international plot as the most radical lodge in revolutionary Paris, and the accusation would arrive, dramatically, in a pair of books and a wave of fear at the very end of the 1790s. The real Illuminati were far smaller and far more short-lived than the legend suggests. They were founded in 1776 in the German region of Bavaria by a professor of law named Adam Weishaupt at the University of Ingolstadt. Weishaupt was a man of the radical Enlightenment, hostile to the power of the church and of kings, and he dreamed of a secret society of enlightened men who would work quietly to spread reason, weaken superstition and tyranny, and improve the world according to their ideals. He borrowed some of the trappings of Freemasonry, its degrees and its secrecy, to structure his order, and for a few years the group grew, recruiting members across parts of Germany. But it never became the vast machine of legend. In the mid-1780s, the ruler of Bavaria cracked down on secret societies, banned the Illuminati, and seized their papers. The order was broken and effectively ceased to exist as an organized body within about a decade of its founding. Weishaupt lived out his life in exile and obscurity. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it was the beginning.
In the late 1790s, two writers seized on the story of the suppressed Illuminati and transformed it into something enormous. One was a French priest, the Abbé Baruel, who published a sprawling work arguing that the French Revolution had been the work of a hidden conspiracy of philosophers, Freemasons, and Illuminati. The other was a Scottish scientist and professor named John Robison, himself a Freemason, who in 1797 published a book with the alarming title Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All the Religions and Governments of Europe. Robison argued that the Illuminati had survived their suppression, gone underground, infiltrated the Masonic lodges of Europe, and used them as cover to engineer the French Revolution and to plot against religion and monarchy everywhere.
Both books were, by the standards of serious history, deeply flawed. They took the real but modest documents of the defunct Bavarian Illuminati and spun from them a fantasy of a vast, ongoing, world-spanning plot. They committed a crucial confusion, treating the Illuminati and Freemasonry as one and the same, when in truth the Illuminati had merely borrowed Masonic forms, were a rival rather than a branch of the fraternity, and were actively opposed by many Masons. The apolitical English and Scottish lodges had, in fact, largely worked to keep such radical infiltrators out. But the books were thrilling, frightening, and enormously popular. And they crossed the Atlantic to a young United States already anxious about foreign influence and the violence of the French Revolution.
In America, the fear caught fire, especially in New England, where alarmed clergymen took up the cry. A prominent minister named Jedediah Morse preached fiery sermons warning that the Illuminati had secretly infiltrated American society and its Masonic lodges, and that the Republic itself was in danger from this hidden conspiracy. For a season round 1798, a genuine panic spread through parts of the country, a wave of suspicion that secret societies were plotting the nation's ruin.
And here the story arrives at a remarkable document, one that lets us hear George Washington himself speak on the matter. In the summer of 1798, a German-born Lutheran minister named G.W. Snyder, having read Robison's book, wrote to the retired president, warning him of the supposed Illuminati threat to American Freemasonry. Washington replied, and his letters survive. He acknowledged that he had read of Robison's alarming claims, and he was careful and measured in his response. He did not believe, he wrote, that the lodges of Freemasons in the United States had been infected with the dangerous principles of the Illuminati, and he gently corrected the minister's assumption that he, Washington, actively presided over American Freemasonry, noting that he had in fact had very little involvement with the fraternity in recent years. It is a quietly telling exchange. The most famous Freemason in America, confronted directly with the conspiracy theory that would attach itself to his name for centuries, calmly denied that American lodges were part of any such plot, and gently distanced himself from any active leadership of the craft. The father of the country, it turns out, was one of the first Americans to have to answer the Masonic conspiracy theory, and he answered it with a shrug and a denial.
The great fear of 1798 faded within a year or two, as such panics do. But it had planted something durable. The confusion of Freemasonry with the Illuminati, the image of secret societies pulling the strings of history, the idea that the lodges concealed a plot against religion and government, all of this now lived in the American imagination, waiting. It would not need to wait long. Within a single generation, a scandal far closer to home would tear the fraternity apart. But before the storm, there came a golden hour. The golden hour before the storm. Before we follow the fraternity into its sudden collapse, it is worth standing for a moment at its highest point, in the years of the 1820s, so that we can feel just how far it had risen, and therefore how far it had to fall. For this was the golden hour of American Freemasonry, the moment when its prominence in public life shone brightest, just before the shadow fell across it.
The great symbol of that golden hour was the return of Lafayette. The Marquis de Lafayette, the young French nobleman who had crossed the ocean to fight beside Washington and had become one of the most beloved figures of the Revolution, came back to the United States in the years 1824 and 1825 for a grand farewell tour. He was by then an old man, the last living Major General of the Revolutionary War, and the nation received him with an outpouring of affection that is difficult to describe. Enormous crowds turned out in city after city. There were parades, banquets, and speeches without end. And at stop after stop, Lafayette, himself a Freemason, was greeted by his Masonic brethren as one of their own, welcomed into lodges, honoured with Masonic ceremony, celebrated as a brother as well as a hero.
The high point of that celebration came at Bunker Hill. In June of 1825, on the 50th anniversary of the famous battle where the Patriot leader and Freemason Joseph Warren had fallen, the cornerstone of a great monument was to be laid on the hill above Boston. And once again, the ceremony was Masonic. The Grand Lodge of Massachusetts conducted the rites. Lafayette himself took part in laying the stone, and the celebrated orator Daniel Webster rose to deliver an address that would be remembered for generations. Half a century after independence, the nation was still marking its most sacred sites with the aprons and tools of the fraternity, still treating the Masons as the natural celebrants of American memory.
And yet, within a single year, everything would change. The very qualities that had made the fraternity strong, its secrecy, its solemn oaths, its bonds of mutual protection, were about to be turned against it by a scandal that no one saw coming. The golden hour was ending. The storm was about to break, and it would break not in Washington or Boston, but in a small town on the western frontier of New York, over the disappearance of a man almost no one had heard of. The vanishing of William Morgan. Every story of rise contains somewhere the seed of a fall, and Freemasonry's moment of greatest public power in America was followed quite suddenly by its steepest decline. The turning point came not from any grand political battle, but from the disappearance of a single obscure man in western New York in the year 1826.
His name was William Morgan. He was a bricklayer and stonecutter of no great distinction, living in the town of Batalia, New York. A man who claimed to have been made a Freemason and who had fallen out bitterly with his local brethren. In 1826, Morgan announced that he intended to publish a book, a full exposure of the secret rituals of Freemasonry, laying bare the words and ceremonies the fraternity had guarded for a century. To the Masons of the region, this was a betrayal and a threat. What followed reads like a slow, grim descent. Morgan was harassed. He was arrested on flimsy, trumped-up charges, a supposed unpaid debt, a supposed petty theft, the kind of accusations that could land a poor man in jail. He was moved from one jail to another, and then, in the middle of September 1826, near the Niagara frontier, William Morgan vanished. He was taken from custody, driven away in a carriage, and never reliably seen again. It was widely believed that he had been abducted and murdered by Freemasons determined to silence him and to prevent his book from reaching the public.
His body was never conclusively found. What made the affair explosive was not only the disappearance, but the aftermath. When authorities tried to investigate and prosecute, they ran into walls. Witnesses would not talk. Local officials, some of them Freemasons themselves, seemed to obstruct the inquiry. The Brotherhood's bonds of secrecy and mutual protection, which in ordinary times meant charity and fellowship, now appeared to mean something darker, a network closing ranks to shield its own from justice. In the short term, the Masons involved largely escaped serious punishment. But in the longer and more important court of public opinion, they lost catastrophically. The anti-Masonic storm. The reaction to Morgan's disappearance swelled into something no one could have predicted. A wave of public anger against Freemasonry that swept across the northern states and reshaped American life for a decade.
Ordinary citizens, especially in New York and New England, became convinced that they had glimpsed the true face of the fraternity, a secret aristocracy that held itself above the law, that protected its members from justice, that placed loyalty to the brotherhood above loyalty to the republic. In a young democracy suspicious of privilege and secrecy, this was an intolerable image. The outrage spread through churches, through newspapers, through town meetings. Preachers denounced the lodge from their pulpits. Communities pressured their neighbours to renounce their membership.
And then, remarkably, the anger organised itself into politics. There arose an anti-Masonic movement, and from it an anti-Masonic party. This was something genuinely new in American history, widely regarded as the country's first significant third party, the first organized political party to rise up outside the two main factions of the day. It demanded investigations, it opposed Masons holding public office, and it channeled a broad popular anxiety about secret societies into the machinery of elections. The party even mounted a national presidential campaign in the early 1830s, and though it never captured the presidency, its rise showed how deeply the fear of Freemasonry had penetrated the public mind. Along the way, the anti-Masonic movement pioneered political techniques, such as the nominating convention, that the major parties would soon adopt for themselves. The effect on Freemasonry itself was devastating. In the decade after the Morgan affair, the fraternity hemorrhaged members. Thousands upon thousands of men quit the order, whether out of genuine disillusionment or simple fear of the public hostility that membership now attracted. Hundreds of lodges shut their doors. In parts of the country, Freemasonry, which had so recently laid the cornerstone of the nation's capital with the president himself presiding, nearly ceased to exist. The society that had stood at the glittering center of early American civic life was suddenly a thing to be renounced and hidden. Freemasonry did eventually recover. In the decades after the Civil War, its numbers grew again,
and it became once more a large and respectable feature of American social life, though of a quieter, more strictly charitable and fraternal character. But it never again wielded the semi-official public prominence it had held in those first 50 years of independence. The Morgan affair had broken something. The spell of the aprons and the ceremonies, the sense that the Masons were the natural celebrants of the Republic, did not fully return. The first third party.
The political movement that grew from William Morgan's disappearance deserves a closer look, because it did something no one intended. It permanently changed the machinery of American democracy, and it did so while trying to destroy a fraternity. The story of the anti-Masonic party is one of the strangest and most consequential in the nation's political history. At the center of it stood a shrewd newspaper editor named Thurlow Weed. Operating out of western New York, in the very region where Morgan had vanished, Weed grasped the political potential of the public outrage and set about organizing it. In 1728, he helped launch a newspaper devoted to the cause, and soon anti-Masonic papers multiplied across the northern states, dozens of them in New York and Pennsylvania alone, feeding a steady diet of suspicion and indignation to readers who had come to see the fraternity as a secret aristocracy above the law. Weed and his allies turned a moral panic into a political machine.
What made the movement so potent was that it tapped into something broader than the Morgan affair itself. This was the age of Andrew Jackson, an age of rising democratic feeling, of ordinary men demanding a larger share in their own government and growing suspicious of privileged elites and secret combinations. Freemasonry, with its exclusive membership, its secret oaths, and its powerful, well-connected members, was the perfect target for that democratic anxiety. The anti-Masons argued that a society which bound its members by secret oaths to aid one another, even, it seemed, in shielding a murderer from justice, was fundamentally incompatible with equal citizenship in a republic. Membership in the fraternity became, in these regions, a political liability, and candidates were pressed to renounce it. The movement drew in serious figures. Former President John Quincy Adams became one of its notable supporters, lending the cause the weight of his name and writing against the fraternity. And in the early 1830s, the anti-Masonic party did something that would echo far beyond its own brief life. In 1731, gathering in Baltimore, it held the first national presidential nominating convention in American history. Until then, candidates for president had typically been chosen behind closed doors by caucuses of political insiders. The anti-Masons, true to their hostility towards secret elite decision-making, threw the process open, bringing together delegates from many states to choose their candidate in the open and to announce a formal platform of principles, another first. They nominated a Maryland lawyer and former Attorney General named William Wirt to run for president in the election of 1732.
Wirt did not win. Andrew Jackson, who was himself a proud and open Freemason and one of the few national leaders willing to defend the fraternity publicly, swept to re-election. Wirt gathered only a modest share of the national vote and carried a single state. As a vehicle for capturing the presidency, the anti-Masonic party failed. But measured by its deeper effects, it succeeded beyond anything its founders could have imagined. The nominating convention it pioneered was quickly adopted by the major parties and became, and remains to this day, the standard way American parties choose their presidential candidates. The party's techniques of mass organization, its use of a partisan press, and its appeal to ordinary voters against entrenched elites all fed into the political culture that followed. As the movement's single issue faded, most of its members flowed into the new Whig Party, carrying their organizing skills and their distrust of unchecked power with them.
So the anti-Masonic party, born from the disappearance of an obscure bricklayer and dedicated to destroying a secret brotherhood, ended by reshaping the open machinery of American democracy. It is one of history's quiet ironies. The fraternity that so many believed was secretly designing the nation was, in the end, not the designer, but the occasion. It was the backlash against Freemasonry, not Freemasonry itself, that left the deeper mark on how Americans actually govern themselves. And that backlash, having reshaped the nation's politics, also very nearly finished the fraternity that had provoked it, as the lodges emptied and the doors closed across the land. The long afterlife. The anti-Masonic storm broke the fraternity's power, but it did not end its story, and the long afterlife of American Freemasonry is worth tracing briefly because it quietly confirms much of what we have been saying all along. A body that could be nearly destroyed by a single scandal and that then survived by becoming ever more modest and charitable was never the all-powerful hidden empire of legend.
Through the middle decades of the 1800s, Freemasonry lay low, its numbers thinned, its public prominence gone. But slowly, especially in the years after the Civil War, it recovered. Men drifted back to the lodges. New members were initiated. The empty halls filled again. Yet the fraternity that emerged from this recovery was different in spirit from the one that had laid the capital's cornerstone. It had learned caution. It leaned harder than ever into its role as a charitable and social brotherhood, and it made no more claims to stand at the ceremonial center of the Republic. It became, in effect, one fraternal society among the many that flourished in 19th-century America, valued by its members for fellowship and good works, largely ignored by everyone else.
Round the core fraternity there grew, over time, a whole family of associated organizations, the appendant bodies, which many people now vaguely associate with Freemasonry without quite understanding. There arose additional systems of higher degrees, elaborating on the basic three, offering members further ceremonies and further lessons. There arose later, in the 1800s, a famous order devoted to good humor and increasingly to charity, which became known for its distinctive headgear and, in time, for founding and funding hospitals for children, a genuine and lasting public good. And there arose an order that at last made a place for women in the wider Masonic world, open to Master Masons and to their female relatives, giving wives, daughters, and sisters a role that the lodge itself had always denied them. These bodies gave American Freemasonry much of its familiar modern face, more a network of clubs and charities than anything resembling a secret government.
Meanwhile, the parallel tradition founded by Prince Hall endured and grew against long odds. Denied recognition by the mainstream white Grand Lodges for generation after generation, Prince Hall Freemasonry nonetheless spread through black communities across the nation, multiplying into dozens of Grand Lodges and hundreds of thousands of members over the centuries.
It became, as we noted, one of the oldest and most important institutions founded by African Americans, a training ground for black leadership, mutual aid, and civil rights activism through the long era of slavery and segregation. Only in the closing decades of the 20th century did many mainstream Grand Lodges finally begin to extend formal recognition to their Prince Hall counterparts, a belated acknowledgement of a brotherhood that had been kept at arm's length for 200 years. The gap that Prince Hall had been forced to cross in 1775 took 2 centuries to begin to close.
And what of the presidents? Here the legend seizes on a genuine fact, though it draws the wrong conclusion from it. Over the long span of American history, a substantial number of presidents have indeed been Freemasons, at least 14 by the usual counting, from Washington and Monroe and Jackson in the early Republic to Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and others in the modern age. Truman took the fraternity so seriously that he served as the head of the Masons of his entire state before he ever reached the White House. To a conspiracy-minded eye, this parade of Masonic presidents looks like proof of hidden control. But look more closely and the impression dissolves. These men span more than a century and a half, belonged to opposing parties, and pursued wildly different and often directly conflicting policies. They were Masons because Freemasonry was, for much of American history, simply one of the most common and respectable fraternal affiliations a public-minded man might hold, alongside his church and his political party and his civic clubs. That a good many ambitious, sociable, joining sort of men who rose to the presidency also belonged to the largest fraternal order in the country is not evidence of a plot. It is evidence of how ordinary and widespread the fraternity once was. A secret cabal does not span 2 centuries and both parties while quarrelling with itself over every major question of the age. A common social institution does exactly that.
So the long afterlife of American Freemasonry tells, in the end, the same story as its founding era, only more plainly. It was a large, visible, human institution, capable of being nearly destroyed by scandal, capable of recovering by becoming humbler and kinder, capable of excluding and then slowly including, woven through the nation's life not as a hidden hand, but as one thread among thousands. Which brings us at last to the reckoning we have been building toward all night, the honest accounting of what this fraternity truly gave to America and what it did not. What Freemasonry really gave America. We have travelled a long way tonight, from a muddy cornerstone by the Potomac, back across the ocean to medieval stonecutters and a London tavern, through the lodges of colonial Philadelphia and Boston, into the lives of Washington and Franklin, across the battlefields of the Revolution, onto the back of a dollar bill, and finally to a vanished man in western New York, whose disappearance nearly destroyed the whole fraternity. So let us gather what we have found and set it out plainly, separating what we know from what we only imagine.
What we know is this. Freemasonry was genuinely important to the world of the American founding. It was real, it was widespread, and it counted among its members some of the most consequential figures of the age. It gave those men something precious in a scattered and divided colonial world, a network of trust that crossed the boundaries of colony and class, a shared set of ideals about brotherhood, merit, charity, and self-improvement,
and a congenial home for the Enlightenment values of reason and human dignity that were reshaping the Western mind. When Washington laid the Capitol's cornerstone in his apron, he was expressing something sincere, a belief that the fraternity's ideals of building, of order, of virtue belonged in the foundation of the new nation. That belief was real, and it left real marks on American civic ritual.
What we do not know, because there is no evidence for it, is the grander claim that Freemasonry secretly designed and directed the United States. The lodges were not a hidden command structure. They issued no revolutionary orders. They did not tell their members whether to be patriots or loyalists, and indeed produced plenty of both. The men who wrote the Declaration and framed the Constitution were in their majority not Masons at all, and the two most influential minds among them, Jefferson and Madison, stood outside the fraternity entirely. The symbols on the dollar were not a Masonic brand, but a committee's earnest emblems, and they did not even reach the currency until the 1930s. The fraternity was a thread in the fabric of the founding, a bright and genuine thread, but only one among a great many.
The honest conclusion is the quiet one, and it is more satisfying than the legend precisely because it is true. Freemasonry shaped the founding generation. It did not run it. The lodge was a room where some of the founders happened to meet and trust one another, and where a certain hopeful vision of brotherhood was kept alive. It was not the architect of the American house. It was one of the many places where the builders gathered to warm their hands before returning to the far larger work of construction that took place out in the open, in congresses and conventions, in pamphlets and debates, in the ordinary daylight of a nation arguing itself into existence.
There is one last question worth sitting with quietly before we let this story come to rest, and it is perhaps the most interesting of all. If the true history is so modest, so human, so thoroughly documented, then why does the myth persist? Why, after all the careful work of historians, do so many people still half believe that a secret brotherhood designed the United States? The answer lies less in the history of Freemasonry than in the workings of the human mind, and understanding it is a gentle and worthwhile thing to do as the night deepens.
Part of the answer is that the human mind loves a pattern, and loves it most of all when it is hidden. We are, by our nature, seekers of connection and meaning. When we see scattered facts, a Masonic president here, a strange symbol there, a secretive ceremony, an unfinished pyramid on our money, the mind reaches instinctively to draw them together into a single story. A story with a hidden author feels more satisfying, more complete than a scatter of unrelated coincidences. To say that these things are connected by a secret plan is, in a strange way, more comforting than to say they are merely separate pieces of an untidy history. The conspiracy imposes order on chaos, and order, even sinister order, soothes a mind uneasy with randomness.
Part of the answer is that every good conspiracy theory contains a kernel of truth, and this one contains several. Freemasonry was real. It really was secretive. Prominent founders really did belong to it. Its symbols really do appear on the dollar bill. A cornerstone of the Capitol really was laid in a Masonic ceremony by a Masonic president. None of these facts is invented. The theory does not need to lie about the raw materials. It only needs to connect them wrongly, to take true facts and bind them with a false thread of hidden intention. That is what makes it so durable and so persuasive. You cannot refute it simply by denying the facts, because the facts are largely correct. You can only refute it, as we have tried to do tonight, by patiently showing that the connection between them is not what it seems, that the thread of secret design was never there, that each fact has its own ordinary explanation.
Part of the answer is the peculiar power of symbols to invite projection. A symbol, by its nature, is open. An eye, a pyramid, a triangle of light. These images do not announce their own meaning in plain words. They wait, silent, for the viewer to fill them with significance. And so people do. Into the silent eye on the dollar, one person reads the watchful care of God. Another reads the surveillance of a secret order. Another reads something stranger still. The very openness that makes a symbol powerful also makes it a screen onto which any fear or fantasy can be projected. The founders chose emblems meant to convey hope and providence and permanence, but they could not control what later eyes would see in them, and later eyes, primed by rumor, saw conspiracy.
And part of the answer, the deepest part, is emotional. There is a peculiar comfort in believing that someone is in control, even a sinister someone. A world secretly governed by a hidden brotherhood is, for all its menace, a world with a steering wheel. A world where events happen for reasons, where there is a plan behind the confusion. The alternative, the true one, is in some ways harder to accept, that history is driven by vast, tangled, uncoordinated human effort, by millions of people pursuing their own aims, colliding, compromising, stumbling forward without any single hand on the tiller. That is a more honest picture, but it is also a more unsettling one, because it means no one is fully in charge and the future is genuinely open and uncertain. The conspiracy theory offers a strange relief from that uncertainty. It trades the frightening freedom of an unguided history for the grim comfort of a controlled one.
To understand all this is not to sneer at those who believe. The pull toward hidden patterns, toward meaningful connections, toward the comfort of control, is not a defect peculiar to the gullible. It is a feature of the human mind itself, present in all of us, and the same instinct that spins conspiracy theories also, in its healthier forms, drives science and storytelling and the search for truth. The task is not to mock the instinct, but to discipline it, to keep asking, gently, whether the pattern we think we see is really there, whether the connection is genuine or imagined, whether the simpler and more human explanation might, after all, be the true one. And in the case of the Freemasons and the Founding, once you do that patient work, the grand shadow shrinks, and what remains is not a conspiracy, but a history, ordinary, human, and quietly remarkable.
There is a particular kind of comfort in letting a grand conspiracy shrink back down into ordinary history, and it is worth savouring for a moment as our story draws towards its close. The legend of the Masonic founding is exciting, but it is also, in its way, a little cold. It imagines the birth of a nation as something managed by hidden men according to a secret plan, a puppet show with the strings just out of sight. It leaves ordinary people and ordinary reason out of the story.
The truth is warmer. The United States was not conjured by a secret order in a candlelit room. It was argued and stumbled and fought into being by thousands of flawed, brilliant, frightened, hopeful human beings, some of them Freemasons and most of them not, meeting in lodges and taverns and churches and legislative halls, disagreeing constantly, changing their minds, making mistakes, and reaching, across all their differences, for something new in the story of self-government. Freemasonry was part of that human crowd. It lent some of its members trust and fellowship and a language of high ideals. But the credit and the responsibility belongs to the whole messy human enterprise, not to any single hidden hand.
That is why the actual history is not a disappointment when the legend fades. It is a relief. The nation was built by people, in the open, out of argument and compromise and ordinary courage. The eye on the dollar is not watching you with secret intent. It is only an old symbol of hope, that some providence might smile on a fragile experiment. The pyramid is unfinished because the founders knew, honestly, that their work was unfinished and would remain so, handed forward from one generation to the next, like a stone passed from hand to hand along a long line of builders. And so we come back, as we always do, to where we began, to that September morning in 1793, the crowd on the muddy ground beside the Potomac, the tall, grave man in the pale apron with the silver trowel in his hand. Imagine the ceremony finished now. The corn and the wine and the oil have been poured. The ritual words have faded into the warm air. The great ox has been roasted, and the crowd has feasted and begun to drift away toward the ferry and the long road home. The banners are furled, the lodges pack away their tools, the square and the compasses, the level and the plumb. The sun sinks lower over the unfinished city, and the light turns golden and then grey, and long shadows stretch across the raw earth, where in time marble will rise. The cornerstone sits in its trench in the southeast corner, settling into the ground. In the centuries to come, it will be covered over and, curiously, half forgotten. Searchers with metal detectors would one day go looking for that very stone and fail to find it. So completely would it vanish beneath the growing weight of the building above. And there is something quietly fitting in that. The Masonic ceremony that dedicated the Capitol became itself a kind of buried cornerstone of the American legend, hidden beneath a century and a half of story, mistaken by many for the whole foundation, when it was only ever one stone among thousands. The men who laid it were sincere. They believed in their brotherhood and its ideals, and they gave the young nation a gift of ritual and trust that mattered. But the building they helped begin would be finished by countless hands that never wore an apron, and it would be argued over and expanded and repaired by generation after generation of ordinary Americans who never knew a secret grip or a whispered word. That is the truer monument, not a hidden Masonic design, but an open, unfinished, endlessly contested public house, built in the daylight, cornerstone by cornerstone, by the many rather than the few.
Let the eye on the dollar keep its quiet watch. Let the pyramid stay unfinished. There was never a secret hand behind the nation, only a great many human ones, some of them belonging to Freemasons, most of them not, all of them reaching in their imperfect way towards something they hoped would last. And in the end, knowing the smaller, truer story is a gentler thing to carry into sleep than the grand and shadowy legend ever was.
Rest easy tonight. The mystery, once you follow it patiently to the end, turns out to be no threat at all. Only history, laid out in the light, at last making its quiet sense.
Think, as you drift, of how many hands it truly took. Not one hidden hand guiding everything from the shadows, but 100,000 ordinary hands working mostly in daylight and mostly at cross purposes. The hands of the stonemasons who first cut the arches of cathedrals and passed down their signs. The hands of Franklin at his printing press setting the type of a fraternity's rulebook. The hands of Washington on a silver trowel tapping a cornerstone into place. The hands of Paul Revere recognizing his lost friend by a tooth he had wired years before. The hands of 3 committees passing sketches back and forth for 6 long years. The hands of a records-keeping secretary quietly assembling a seal from other men's rejected ideas. The hands of Prince Hall reaching across an ocean for a recognition his own city denied him. The hands of countless forgotten members tying on plain white aprons in tavern rooms, and the hands of the widows and orphans they quietly helped. None of these hands held a secret master plan. Together, without ever meaning to, they made something that outlasted them all.
That is the truth the legend hides, and it is a kinder truth than the legend. A nation is not a machine built to a blueprint by a hidden few. It is a slow, shared, imperfect labor carried out by the many, argued over in the open, handed forward unfinished from one generation to the next, like a stone passed along a long line of builders who will never see the finished wall. The Freemasons were among those builders, and so were a great many people who never knew a secret word. The eye on the dollar was only ever a wish that some providence might watch over the work. The pyramid was left unfinished on purpose because the founders were honest enough to know the work would never truly be done. So let the old symbols keep their quiet watch over your sleep. There is nothing behind them but hope and history and the ordinary courage of ordinary people. And that, in the end, is a far gentler thing to carry into the dark than any secret ever could be.
If this brought you some calm, and if you would like more long, slow journeys through the true stories behind history's most whispered about legends, please consider subscribing so these quiet documentaries can find you again. A like helps more than you know, and if you have a thought about which of history's mysteries you would like unravelled next, leave it in the comments before you drift off. Until next time, sleep well and let the old stories keep watch while you rest.